Hey everyone, it is Brandon Lee. We are sitting down for another episode of Escaping Rock Bottom. I recently met this guest. She was actually on a Facebook Live special on CBS 5 and 3 TV at Arizona's Family. We were talking about addiction and recovery during the pandemic. Her name is Michele. Michele has an incredible story of her own about overcoming addiction and her own recovery, which she'll get to. But there's something else really cool, and why I'm really grateful that she's here is because she actually works in the recovery industry. So she's going to be able to shed some insight and hopefully answer a lot of my questions that I know many of you have asked me. And she's an incredible guest, a little bit of insight on how we can all continue to take care of ourselves even after treatment and after rehab, and really looking at that post-care plan toward a successful life. So with that, welcome, Michele.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's so cool to have you here. And I know we chatted briefly on that Facebook Live special, but to have you here at my home and to be able just to really get real about addiction and recovery, I'm really excited about this. Take me back to your beginning, a little bit about your childhood and where things started to go off the rails for you.
So I was raised in New York in a single parent home. So my mom was 19, maybe she was 20 when she had me. I've never met my dad. I pretty much watched my mom grow up, and that is kind of where everything started. And I like to mention that always in the beginning because things were disconnected from the very start for me. You know, I had a lot of inconsistency. I had a lot of trauma and lack of structure and support as a kid. My mom was really young. We moved around. I've lived in like 10 different states. And so there was no real solid grounding. I was never grounded in anything. Everything was coming and going. And so for me, not knowing my real dad, there was a lot of trauma and a huge void that I didn't really know how to fill. So the second I did drugs and alcohol, the anxiety, the sadness.
How old were you when you tried that first drug?
So I was 12. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I was about 15. You know what's interesting is that when we talk about those childhood traumas, and it's always really important for me to say this, because what I found to be traumatic and what happened to me as a child, never compare traumas, because something can be traumatic to you that may not be traumatic to me. And so that while, yes, I was molested and repeatedly molested as a child, that was traumatic, but I never want that to have somebody sit there and go, well, I was never molested, so my trauma can't be that bad. But even as you said, moving around so often as a child, never really being able to build healthy friendships and those strong friendships with people can be very traumatic for a child.
Yeah.
Just packing up and moving constantly.
Yeah. So I went to a different school from kindergarten all the way till I graduated high school. So I was every year at a different school. So it was a lot of inconsistency. And so from a very small age, I learned two things. One, I was never considered. Right. So that has always been really a foundation in even my drug use, how I have relationships with people. I stay in harmful relationships way too long, way past their expiration date. I do things way past their expiration date because I don't want to experience that sadness, that anxiety that comes with that disconnected relationships. I had the abandonment from my dad. I've never met my real dad. My mom was a single mom. We were, she was chasing boyfriends across the country. So as a boyfriend would move, we would follow, and then I would go to a new school and hop around. Ironically, my mom is also a therapist. So it was very confusing for me. So by day, she helped everybody else with their problems, and by night,
therapists see therapists.
Yeah, it was really confusing. It was really confusing.
I can only imagine. So you were about 12 years old. You kind of dipped into the drugs. Kind of fast forward through a lot of that. What did the end of it kind of look like for Michele to finally say, okay, I just hit rock bottom. Yeah. This is my rock bottom. What did that look like?
You know what? My rock bottom itself was not actually the bottom. The bottom was the beginning to the end. I think everybody has like a beginning of the end, and you know it's coming soon. The bottom was I had relocated myself. I was living in Colorado. I was strung out on meth. My mom kicked me out of the house when I was 16. I lived with my drug dealer from 16 to 18. But originally my mom was a problem. My dad not being around was the problem. Moving was the problem. So then I'm living in my dope dealer's apartment with him doing meth. Then that was the problem. So then I moved to Arizona on my own. And then my dope dealing boyfriend came with me. And then he was the problem. So then I got rid of him and there was no problems left. Like all the things that I used as the problem, it was just me. And I was living in Arizona and I was like, I'm not going to do drugs. Like I'm not going to do it. And I couldn't not do it. And I went to Sedona. My last use was in Sedona. I was 18 years old. I swore off meth. I wasn't going to do it when I got to Arizona, and I went to Sedona and I was wasted and I did a bunch of cocaine, and my bottom was the people that I didn't know. I was with people I had no idea who they were, but I passed out in the back of this guy's truck in this SUV, and they woke me up by setting off the car alarm, and that was my bottom.
Wow.
And I remember I sat up, I woke up and it was in the morning and I looked over and they're all laughing and I had no idea who they were. I was in Sedona. I was passed out in some guy's car that I didn't know. And I had a very, very distinct moment of clarity, and it was, I'm not doing this ever again. And I never did it ever again.
Wow. What year about
that? Was 2000, January 2000.
What age were you when you first got sober?
18.
Oh my gosh. You were first 18. And then did you relapse ever?
No.
My gosh.
No.
It's so crazy.
No, it's crazy.
I thought here I am sitting over here being like, Brandon, you got sober when you were like 28 years old. You were young. Hi, meet Michele. I'm 18 years old. So never let your age determine on when you decide to change your life or when you figure out it's out of control.
Yeah.
God, that's really, really interesting. So throughout your years of recovery, this is really, really why I'm excited to have you here, is because you somehow, some way decided to start your own recovery business. And it's called Modern Recovery, based here in the Valley in Arizona. What inspired you to create Modern Recovery?
I think it was a combination of a lot of things. I got sober really young. I got sober in a program that offered long-term support for 3 years as a step down. And this is, I feel like a dinosaur in recovery sometimes because I have 20 years. We didn't have sober livings. We had like 3-quarter houses and Oxford house. There was just a different verbiage and a different style back then than there is today. But there was a step down procedure. And in the very end of those 3 years, I had a case manager, I guess, quote unquote case manager that I talked to. She called me every single day. Her name's Val. I'm still very close with her today. And all of my friends also have 20 years sober. My husband always laughs because he got sober later on in life, and he was like, all of your friends. I mean, something worked back then because we all have over 20 years sober, and there's not like one or two, there's like 20 of us.
Wow.
And so, moving forward, when I ended up working, I went to school, got my counseling degree, and I started working in treatment. And I was working with adults, and people had been through treatment 20, 30 times. And something was wrong. They always stay sober in treatment, in the structure, with the accountability, with the goals. They always stay sober there, right? It's when the disconnect is when they got out. And what was different so I used what I was witnessing firsthand. What was I experiencing as a professional? And then I looked at my life, my friends who got long-term sobriety, and what was different. The difference was there was a plan. There was a post-discharge plan, and they held on to us long enough to be able to experience support in a different way. It wasn't this traditional therapeutic support. It was somebody reaching out every single day to make sure that those goals were being achieved.
So I tell people that the first 8 years of my recovery, I went to 5 AA meetings a week, which is a lot. Like over the course of 8 years to go to 5 meetings a week, it was combined with like AA and CMA, which is Crystal Meth Anonymous. And I remember, Michele, like talking to my therapist, and I was like, I am so afraid to even say this to you. Shadi, that's my therapist's name, or was. She's no longer my therapist. And I said to her, I feel so shameful about what I'm going to say to you. And you're my therapist.
Yeah.
And I felt this sense of shame. She goes, Brandon, like, you've told me so much. Like, what can be so shameful? And I said, I don't want to go to AA meetings anymore. And for me to even say that just felt so wrong. And I'm like, I just don't want to go. Like, I used to want to go, but why don't I want to go? And I said, I'm getting frustrated actually while I'm sitting in the meeting. And I know that I've always been told, like, that's a warning sign. That's a warning sign. And she was like, Brandon, and she gave me the analogy. She goes, listen, for some people need a meeting every day for the rest of their life. They need that AA structure in their life. She goes, but it's not a one size fits all, Brandon. And she goes, you're probably feeling this. And she gave me this analogy. She goes, you're in 12th grade. You're getting straight A's. Your life is great.
Right.
And you're ready for that next thing. Like, you're ready for that next adventure. Where's that next leap of faith? Where's that next added level of education? You're trying to get into college. You've gotten the acceptance letters, but suddenly your principal says, nope, sorry, you need to stay back. Like, you need to continue to stay back and repeat, stay back and repeat. And you feel like that's stunting your growth. And this is not me, by the way, hating on AA at all. I give them so much credit for laying the most solid of foundations, because I never went to treatment. I never went to rehab, and I was a meth addict. So I just went to AA meetings. So that structure at the beginning, it worked for me. But 8 years sober is when I started to, like, having this real dichotomy shift of my life. And I started increasing my therapy, because that's where I was growing. I was excited to go to therapy, not AA meetings. And so that really started kind of my breaking away from the traditional way of AA. But I always remembered this. The program always said, Brandon, this is your design of living. You get to design your life plan. And so that's when I really started to delve deep into this whole multi-prong approach to healing and recovering. And I'm like, I'm going to add EMDR light therapy. Whoa, suddenly like massive growth and neuroplasticity of our brains. And then I started even more trauma therapy. And that really helped me with my sex addiction, something that AA and SLA never was able to cure for me. Never. And up until May, when I really started my in-depth trauma therapy, is the first time in my life that I've finally gotten my sex addiction under control. Your story is fairly similar into how you broke away into creating a different program.
And I saw that there was, you have these 12-step groups, and they're great for this foundational new beginning, experience, strength, and hope. You don't feel so alone in the world. There's a lot of really positive things to that community. And it gave me, I was the 18-year-old that was 12-stepped at a Denny's by a group of AA members. And that's how I got sober. But having somebody to help you navigate even that world is really important, because what happens is there's people that aren't well and they stay in the rooms of AA or CA or CMA, and they're giving people advice. So, I hear it all the time. You need to come off all your medication. I'm like, don't come off all your medication. Like, why are you telling people that? Or they'll tell people to go back to, and this may happen for females. This happens often. It's like, look at your part. Say you get raped, and you get raped when you're drunk. They'll be like, look at your part. And your part is because you were drunk. It's your fault that you got raped. And you have to figure out what your part is in some of these traumatic experiences. Sometimes I've heard sponsors want you to go back to your abuser and make amends. And Nowhere in the history of therapy in any modality are you supposed to be going to do that. So being able to have somebody even help navigate, like, where do you fit in the recovery, the 12-step world, right? So that's what, modern recovery essentially helps you navigate that. It's a third party of trained professionals that mitigate any type of situation that could be re-traumatizing.
That brings up this one story, and I write about it in my book, Mascara Boy, and it's a story where I'm sharing at a meeting, and this guy comes up to me, And he goes, I want you to be my sponsor. And I was always taught, you always say yes. When somebody asks you to be a sponsor, you always say yes. That's what my sponsors always told me. And I'm looking at this guy and I'm like, I can, just my gut. My gut was like, he's trouble. My gut's like, he's trouble. But I was always told, like, I don't have a choice. I always have to say yes.
You always say yes.
Yeah, so I said yes.
I had that too.
Oh my gosh. This guy, you know what he tells me? In one of our first meetings, like he really felt open enough to really go deep. And he told me that he was raping and having sex with his girlfriend's 7-year-old daughter. And I went white and I went into panic mode in my head. And I'm sitting there being like, don't show your panic. Don't show your panic. And I said, hey, listen, I got to step outside. I got outside and I immediately called police. And I think that goes back to my story of being a child of sex abuse. And to know the kind of harm and the hurt that causes, and my instinct was, oh my God, I'm going to call police. So I call police, call the detective, and they come and they arrest this guy. I was ostracized by a few old timers in AA who told me, how dare you call police when somebody confided in you? Yeah. And it really, it spiraled me into a depression because I was like, what was I supposed to do? Like, wait, I wasn't supposed to tell police that there was a little girl being harmed and being raped by this man just because he told me in confidence in an AA room. And I will never forget what the detective told me. She goes, some people will hate you for what you just did. She goes, but I'm telling you, you did the right thing. And she goes, and I'm also going to tell you this. Had you not said anything, you would have been an accomplice and you would have been charged with either like obstructing justice. You would have been charged criminally, knowing that information and not saying anything. But again, that goes back to your point that people in the rooms of AA, they are not trained therapists.
I'm really glad you shared that story, by the way.
You know, because it happens.
No, it happens. Even I've had the experience where, you know, people have gone away that we've known in the rooms and they've gone away for, you know, child pornography, child molestation, things like that. And people have known about it. And they didn't say anything. And some of the people were like, well, self will run riot. And I'm like, okay, hold up. Child molestation and attraction towards children is not alcoholism.
No.
Right. And this is not a room where those people hide out in and then they can get it off their chest by writing an inventory and sharing it. And that's some of the dysfunction that has occurred as a result of not having some of these checks and balances that we're talking about. So, I mean, I'm really glad you called. Not a lot of people do that. And it's shocking.
It was
right?
really, I was shocked. And that was really, I would say that was the first really negative experience that I had in the rooms. And it really has thrown me even to this day that mentality still exists. The rooms are not perfect. Nothing is. No. But it's also really important that if we really want to get raw and real about the efficacy rate, about how many people stay sober, but not only stay sober, but like, my God, grow spirituality, like grow as a human being and grow in a healthy way.
Right.
Because, if I applied the same rules to sex that I did with drugs and alcohol, then I would have 4 months clean.
Right.
Right. Why? Because sex isn't a substance.
Right.
That I don't have to recount my days. But it took me up until this point, up until May of 2020, to finally get a trauma therapist who can really go deep and really help me with those things to where, like, for the first time in my life, I really feel like the change of sex addiction had been cut.
Right.
Like, I feel the most free and in control of that part of my life that I've ever been. I haven't been affiliated with AA for a few years now, but that growth happened through therapy.
Right.
And so there's been like, and I think it's kind of cool, like they're called like life coach or sober coaches, but I guess it's kind of like, I always tell people, definitely work with somebody who has the training, who has that certification. They've done the schoolwork, they know the science behind it, and be open and willing to try science.
Yeah. And somebody who can look for those signs. Right. So it's what Modern Recovery does is we really want to bridge that gap. We don't want to bash the 12-step rooms. We just want to eliminate any possible triggers that it may create with some people walking in either for repeated times or someone who's brand new. So what happens is they leave treatment, they have all these goals and objectives, and then they go and they find a sponsor, or they find, somebody who they, look up to at the moment, and it starts to go south and they don't know what to do. Right. So we have like a whole team of trained professionals and that's not the only thing that we do, because that's like that's like 5% of the pie of everything. You have family life, but when you align yourself with somebody who knows your history, the triggers, and they're coming from a perspective of who is this person and what did they need, not what did I do and what am I going to give to them and they have to do what I did. When you come at it from a different angle, and they're not seeing them every day, going to meetings with them every day, it's more objective. And we have a whole clinical team. So our clinical director is the best. She's always like kind of what you were describing with sex addiction. Some of our coaches will be like, well, why aren't they getting it? They're removing, cannabis, but they can't remove alcohol yet. And she's like, they don't know what they don't know yet. We're going to keep working with them. We're going to keep supporting. They don't want them to remove alcohol yet. And we're not going to force them to do that. They're not there yet. They don't know what they don't know. And until you start to dig deep, right? Until that trauma therapist can start to find the pathways and make the connections, it's not going to fire different, right? So our hope is to hold on to people as long as we can to help them know what they need to know to get as healthy as that they can possibly be.
And I think you have to in order to believe that, you have to believe that trauma really is one of the biggest gateways to addiction and to numbing. I say 100%. To numbing because you can numb with food, you can numb with this. So I'll say numbing. So until we address and really treat that trauma, you can have 20 years in the rooms of AA, or you can have that, but you could still be a mess in your own personal life because you've never addressed the trauma. And I'm here to say, with all the meetings I hit, AA does not address trauma. That you could do 4-step work, but I'm talking real professional rewiring of the brain. I always, if you're listening, you can't see what I'm doing, but essentially we're born into this world with our wires firing right? That's why I say you're born into this world perfect for the most part. And then, but any trauma really, it does this. And we begin to misfire. It throws off that wiring. Well, the only way those wires come back together is not by just quitting cold turkey drinking or drugging. It's actually going back to the trauma, using medical advancements in science and rewiring. And that way, when your wires are recentered, you begin to operate and fire in what's healthy and safe for you.
Right.
But until you do that, you can white knuckle. I mean, we can all throw time together.
Right.
But what is the quality of your life behind that time?
Right. And to take it a step further, what's healthy and safe for you may not be the same for me. And that's okay too. And until we can honor this space where respectfully, like our wellness may look different, and that's okay, because our trauma is different, And I didn't start really working on my trauma until I think I was 14 years sober, right? I had a terrible incident, and I was like, oh my God. I started thinking about suicide every single day at 14 years sober, and I'm not a suicidal person, never have been. And I was obsessing over it. And that's when I really started. I was so resistant to therapy because my mom was a therapy, because there's trauma there, So all the things started to connect for me. And at some point I was like, oh, I need therapy. I need some like real trauma work around, I'm using my mom being a therapist to avoid therapy at this point. Like, this is like tenfold. So
one of the questions that I get asked all the time is, I can't afford that like high-end boutique style recovery center. And because there's a huge spectrum of recovery resources out there. What do you tell people who are like, listen, I may have state-funded, health insurance, or maybe I don't have health insurance, like nothing's available to me. Like, how do I get resources to do that? And I sometimes like don't have that answer because I'm not in that world the way you are.
Right. There's a ton of resources out there for the wide range. And it goes from like state-funded access all the way up to private pay. Please don't tell my insurance company because I don't want anybody to find out. And there's a whole list of everything in between. The problem is that I find is that a lot of times these people are calling maybe just a middle of the road treatment center, and they are not doing their job by having the resources to give them the resources to the access providers, right? So the problem is also that we don't work as a community a lot of times.
Treatment industry.
Right. And so And so it becomes this like this shit show, honestly, where the people at the bottom end kind of get lost, and the people at the top end get taken care of. But then also there's this middle ground that is just, you can refer up, or you got to have a really good range of resources, and they're out there. They're hard to find, but the people that need the resources for kind of the lower spectrum, socioeconomic, they don't even necessarily have the computers to be able to do that or to make those phone calls. So it's almost like this needs to be a community-wide project. Like police officers, I'm on a thing that the state of Arizona has a project called the Angel Initiative, where if a police officer goes out and there's a substance abuse or a drunken call, they're supposed to call someone from the Angel Initiative to come out, and we'll handle it, get the resources, do everything that we need to do. I've never gotten a call in the 2 years. So there's a disconnect between the people who are needing the services, the fire department, the police department, and then there's grants, there's people put in place to help, but we don't get calls. So how do we bridge those gaps too?
It does make sense.
It's a community project.
It is a community, and that really is working. And that goes back to even the whole mental health issue that we're dealing with as really an epidemic in this country, and dealing with the homeless and the underserved, and all the police that are going out to these mental calls. A majority of the police are responding to those calls are mental health calls. So there really needs to be that connect between the recovery treatment world and the city, and the city's emergency resources and response teams. Yeah. And that's something that we need to really work on and focus on.
Yeah. We had a client who relapsed last 2 weekends ago. She was completely inebriated, totally intoxicated. We called the police 10 times. They wouldn't take her. Then the one time they did take her, they took her, but then they didn't take her anywhere except to the gas station to pick up alcohol and then dropped her off at a hotel. The Scottsdale police did that for a call for a drunken, disorderly, intoxicated woman who was threatening suicide. They took her to get alcohol and dropped her off at a hotel. I have no words. Like I was like, who do I call? Right? Like, she's threatening suicide. I can't call the crisis unit on somebody else. They have to call it on themselves. So there's a huge disconnect in this whole system. And so the girl's still drunk. I got a phone call at 5:45 this morning. I can't call the police because she's not going to go anywhere. There's no system.
Yeah. Okay. So let me ask you this. What's it like? And what I love in the recovery world is that a lot of people like yourself have your own story to be able to connect with people who come in. I always say the guy who broke through to me, I ended up finding out had 15 years in recovery. He just happened to be at the intake at the mental health unit at the hospital. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a therapist, but he was licensed as an intake, and he had 15 years sober. And he was the guy that broke through to me. Nobody else had up until that point,
right?
Because he had walked in my shoes. What's that like for you, being able to connect with somebody who needs help, being like, I get it? Because I think in the recovery world, it's mandatory.
It's mandatory.
Because
you have no buy-in. You have no buy-in.
You have no buy-in. When somebody's like, I understand. And this way, no, do you? Were you an addict?
Right.
Because it's just like that one part of like the medical field and the tree. Like, you have to walk in my shoes in order for me to believe you.
So we work with that. Modern Recovery works with adolescents, and this is a huge deal with adolescents. And the parents are always like, she's not going to tell you anything. She's not going to talk to you. I'm like, just get her in front of me. Just literally just get her. Non-addicts don't get it. They don't get it. Like the second I start talking about the feeling of what methamphetamine feels after that first hit, and they understand, or the first acid trip, or you come at them from an angle where there's buy-in.
Yeah.
Like there's no judgment. There's no shame. There's no stigma around it. We're just there to relate. And so when you can start to connect with somebody on that level, and you've been in their shoes, but you're removed from it, so you can kind of, I always say, like, I visit a little bit and then I throw a life preserver and start to like reel them, and then I'll visit again and throw a life preserver and then reel them back out. But it's so imperative that you can connect with them, or you have you have no buy-in, right? They're not going to believe you. They
Right.
need to be able to trust you. They've been completely thrown under the bus. I always say that addicts and alcoholics, they have a tendency to be like even exploited. Like there's places and they'll be like, well, she was drunk. And I'm like, oh yeah, but you're the sober one who was acting like an asshole.
Right.
Like, of course she's late for her. Of course she stole somebody's shampoo. Are you expecting anything different? Like, it's so shocking to me. They're like, oh, well, she yelled at the staff. Like, because we do a lot of advocacy on our recovery desk. And she yelled at the staff. And I'm like, duh, you're making me want to yell at you too. Yeah. And I have tools. So you have to come from a place of
there's just a level of natural born empathy
100%
that you can't teach. You can't teach. Mm-mm. You have to live through an experience.
Yeah.
What's like a final thought that you would love like people listening and watching right now to kind of take away?
Oh, final thought.
Living in this crazy world right now where everything is throwing everybody for a loop. Sometimes life like feels upside down. It looks upside down. Like, what's that kind of parting thought with where we're at in society today?
Honestly, my final thought is really like take care of the underdog. You know what I mean? Be willing to step out of the box and to stand up for the underdog. No matter at any cost, maybe be a little bit uncomfortable with your own life and lifestyle to help others would be my final thought.
I love it. And that's Michele from Modern Recovery. You can check them out on Facebook. You can check them out on social media, but definitely do a Google search, Modern Recovery, Arizona, Phoenix. It'll definitely populate. And reach out to Michele if you have any questions. You can even, if you're watching even on Facebook, just leave a comment. Michele will definitely scour all over online to kind of hopefully go out there and maybe
resources,
because resources are everything in recovery. So thank you for sharing a little bit of your personal story, but also your adult part of your story, which is in the recovery world, which I just find so fascinating. And thank you. Share this podcast with anybody who you think needs to hear a message of hope. Or maybe of a mom or dad who's looking for answers, who has a son or a daughter who's struggling right now and they're looking for answers, looking for hope. Definitely play this podcast for them and maybe have them even reach out to Michele to figure out a plan forward. And for those of you who are struggling, don't give up on yourself. Look at myself, look at Michele. We were both meth addicts and we both built lives for ourselves. Truly, in the depths of my addiction, never even thought could happen. Truly unimaginable. And it's come true. And I'm so grateful. And I'm living the best life I've ever lived before. Is it easy every day? Hell to the no. I'm living in a pandemic. I'm living in this crazy world that we're all living in. It's never easy and perfect. But boy, it helps when we have the resources available to get through it. So thanks for tuning in for another episode of Escaping Rock Bottom. We'll see you back here next week.